So, fluoride and IQ. You may have heard that there have been a number of studies that have been published in recent years that have found that children exposed to high levels of fluoride have been found to have lower intelligence, reduced IQ scores. Now, when people hear that at first, it's kind of a surprise. It's odd. It seems like an aberration. Maybe the studies just got it wrong. They're missing something. The purpose of this presentation here is to put these IQ studies in context and to look at the other studies that have been conducted on fluoride and the brain that help to explain why these IQ studies are not an aberration. They're actually very consistent with what we have learned about how fluoride affects the developing brain. So that's what we're going to look at here. We're going to go through a few slides and try to keep this moving. So thank you all again for attending this presentation here at the FAN conference. OK, so let's begin. I'm going to start here with Dr. Phyllis Mullenix's story. Dr. Phyllis Mullenix was a leading toxicologist who had done a number of studies looking at the effects of certain cancer treatment chemicals, cancer drugs for children. And she found that these drugs could affect the brains of the kids. And she was brought in the 1980s to the Forsyth Dental Institute, which is a Harvard-affiliated dental research institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she was asked to study the neurotoxic effects of the chemicals used in dentistry. And the first chemical she was asked to study was fluoride, which she was a little disappointed by because she just didn't expect to find anything. She employed a rigorous methodology called the computer pattern recognition system, which was designed to study the behavioral effects of chemicals. And based on what she found in that study, which she repeated multiple times, because when she first saw the results, she was skeptical. She thought maybe there was something wrong because she was seeing that the fluoride-treated animals were behaving differently than the non-fluoride-treated animals. And her colleagues said, let's run the study again and see if we get the same numbers. They ran the study again, and they got the same numbers, and they became more and more confident that this was, in fact, a real result. But based on what she found, she predicted, based on the behavioral pattern disruption that she found, that fluoride would be a chemical that could cause IQ deficits and learning disabilities in humans. Now, what's significant about that is what Dr. Mullenix did not know when she made that prediction. What she did not know is that there had already been conducted in China a whole 12 studies looking at fluoride and IQ. Because these studies at that time, when she published that paper, were in Chinese. They hadn't yet been published in English and weren't in any English journals. They were unheard of at that point in time. So she was unaware of that. And of these 12 studies that were published from 1989 to 1995, 11 of them, the studies that you see there in red, found an association between fluoride and reduced IQ. The one in black was the one study of that initial 12 that did not find a reduced IQ. So there you see that based on the animal studies, one would expect that fluoride could cause an IQ deficit. And of course, the IQ studies kept on coming. We now have, at this point in time, we have a total of 48 studies, 48 human studies that have investigated the relationship between fluoride and IQ. Of those 48, 41 have found an association between fluoride exposure and reduced IQ, which is a pretty high percentage of the studies. Not all of them statistically significant, but most of them. And 17 of the 48 studies have found the reduction in IQ at levels that are deemed safe here in the United States. And by safe, I mean I'm referring to the Environmental Protection Agency's safe drinking water level, or the maximum contaminant level, which is set at 4 parts per million. So 17 of the human studies looking at fluoride and IQ have found reductions in IQ below 4 parts per million. So the IQ studies are the tip of the iceberg in terms of the research that has been done on fluoride's effects on the brain. So the IQ studies is what everyone's been paying attention to, rightfully so. But what we're going to do now is we're going to look at what the rest of the iceberg shows in terms of the research. And we're going to start with animal studies. There have been, to this day, over 100 animal studies. And that's actually, I think the number now is in the ballpark of 130, 140. There are studies being published on almost a bi-weekly basis, which you can access by going to PubMed. At the Fluoride Action Network, we now monitor these studies and are posting them regularly on our study tracker. But there have been over 100 animal studies that have been published that have found that fluoride can damage the brain. And it's difficult to summarize these studies succinctly because they're complex and they're quite, there's many different study designs, many different they focus on different aspects of cellular effects, tissue effects. But some of the findings that stand out are that some of the repeated findings that fluoride can damage the hippocampus, which is very significant because the hippocampus is a region of the brain which is really critical to learning and memory. So any agent that can damage the hippocampus is going to, one would suspect, is going to have an effect on cognition. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Dr. Phyllis Mullenix back in the early 1990s was concerned about fluoride's effect on IQ because the rats that she was treating with fluoride had damage to their hippocampal region. So that's a very important aspect of the animal studies on fluoride. Then we have a number of studies showing that fluoride can increase oxidative stress, which is important because that will relate to cellular damage and injury in the brain. And neuronal degeneration, damage to nicotinic receptors, decreased brain glucose utilization, a very interesting study published last year on that, and inhibitions of cholinesterase, an enzyme. And there's many other findings in this batch of studies, again, difficult to summarize succinctly, but shows that clearly that at some dose, fluoride damages the brain. No, unequivocal, there's no doubt about that. Fluoride will damage the brain. So now let's look at a subset of animal studies, which I think are particularly instructive on the question of fluoride and IQ in humans. These animal studies have specifically focused on whether fluoride impacts an animal's ability to learn and or remember. And you'll see here a little maze. This is a Y maze experiment. These are and we'll talk later about different other protocols that the researchers have used. But these studies have long been designed by researchers to study the effects of many other different chemicals or conditions to understand how rats learn. So these are very standard experiments that have now been applied to fluoride. And I have searched the scientific literature pretty thoroughly, both the English literature and looking at Chinese databases and looking for Chinese studies. And I've been able to identify 32 studies that have been published that have looked at fluoride's ability to affect learning or memory. And what's striking about that is that of those 32 studies, 30 have found an impairment in learning, memory, or both. And that's a pretty remarkable percentage of the studies. Now, they're not entirely consistent. There's going to be, some study might have found an effect at 15 parts per million. Some might not have. Some might have found an effect on memory, whereas some might have just found an effect on learning. But each study, almost unanimously, has found that there was some aspect of learning or memory that was impaired in the fluoride-treated animals. And as I mentioned, there's different types of tests that they've used. They've used the Y maze, the T maze, the Morse water maze, the novel object recognition test, the open field test. And despite what some of the proponents of fluoridation might say, the doses that have been used in these animal studies are actually quite modest. They're not as high as some might think. And in fact, just this year, there was a study by Liu and colleagues that found the learning and memory effect at just 5 parts per million in the rat's water. And that was only over a 4-week period. And that's a notably low level because rats are they're not as sensitive to fluoride toxicity as humans. So they don't get as much fluoride into their blood. You need to give a rat more fluoride to get it into their bloodstream and to then get it into their cells and tissues. And so it's been estimated by some researchers that you need to give a rat 4 to 5 times more fluoride to see the same effect as a human. So a 5 part per million effect is essentially the equivalent of a 1 part per million effect in humans, which, as we know, is essentially the level that is added to water for the purpose of water fluoridation. So that's a significant study right there. And it's important to mention here with these learning memory studies that with the IQ studies in humans, one of the critiques is, well, maybe there's some other factor that's really causing these reductions in IQ. Maybe it's not the fluoride. Maybe it's something that the fluoride somehow correlates with, some other contaminant in the water. Well, with the benefit of these animal studies is you have the same type of animal in the same lab, the same conditions, and you give one set of animals the fluoride, and you don't give the fluoride to the other set of animals. That's the only difference in these two groups. And when you do that, you find that the fluoride-treated animals have they have an inability to learn or remember. So it's a very controlled environment, which gives us confidence that indeed fluoride can affect cognition. So here's just a few studies just from 2014. These are just a couple recent studies from 2014. And just a few quick quotes from them. Here's a study by Zhang. We found that sodium fluoride treatment impaired learning and memory in these rats. Again, these data indicate that fluoride and arsenic, either alone or combined, can decrease learning and memory ability in rats. This one, collectively, our data indicate that developmental exposure to sodium fluoride induces cognitive deficits in anxiety, depression-like behaviors in mice. Cognitive deficits. And here we see the Han team impair recognition memory. These are just recent studies. They're coming out on a routine basis. We've already got 30 of them, and something to be very mindful of when we think about whether fluoride reduces IQ and how we look at those fluoride IQ studies. Now let's go to some other human studies that didn't look at IQ. And there are 4 types of studies that I'm going to discuss here. The first is a study that used this, and all of these studies that I'm about to show just use standard ways of assessing neurotoxicity in humans. The first is a test called the Ray-Osterrieth complex figure test. And the study that has dealt with that, I think, is a very important one. A neurobehavioral core test battery, which is a test that was developed by the World Health Organization and National Institute of Safety and Occupational Health, which was designed to identify neurotoxins in the workplace. This neonatal study and fetal brain study. So let's look at those just quickly here. So the first study is this Ray-Osterrieth complex figure test. So what is it? This is a study, well-developed, studied in many different contexts. And the way they do this study is they show a child a figure like this. And they ask the child, try to draw this figure as best you can. Try to replicate this in a drawing. And the child does that. And then after the child finishes making that drawing, they remove this image from the child and they take away the image that the child drew. And then they say, now from your recollection, 3 minutes later, say, from your recollection, try to recall and try to draw out what you saw. And they now have it very standardized, so they know what a normal, typical child, how well they would do. And there's different ways of scoring. There's a quantitative way of scoring this based on the types of details that you're able to recollect. So there's a standardized scoring system, and so we can say if you're a 6-year-old or you're a 7-year-old, you're an 8-year-old, this is how you would typically perform in this experiment. So here, this is a study that was performed down in Mexico by Roca Amador. Principal investigator on the team is Jacqueline Calderon, who's been doing some excellent work down there. It's a high-quality study. It controlled for the key variables that the critics of the IQ test often say the studies haven't controlled for. It controlled for education, it controlled for nutritional status, it controlled for socioeconomic indicators, and exposure to other contaminants. And this is an area of Mexico where they have various types of contaminants: fluoride, arsenic, PCBs, lead. And they controlled very carefully for each of those contaminants. And in the fluoride community, it was primarily fluoride and arsenic. And they controlled very carefully for both of those chemicals. And how do they control for those? They took the levels of the contaminant in the children's urine. So that gave them a very good individualized exposure for both of those contaminants. And when they did those analyses, the first thing that was of note is that the contribution, the damage caused by the fluoride level in the urine was significantly greater, both in magnitude and statistical significance, in damaging the child's ability to perform the test. So the fluoride effect was much larger than the arsenic effect, which is of note, especially since promoters of fluoridation often will say that maybe the arsenic was causing the IQ loss and not the fluoride. But here are a couple of the findings from the study. Here, this summarizes the initial phase, how well the child could copy the figure that they're seeing with their own eyes. Approximately 9 out of 10 children were unable to copy the ROCF as expected for their age. 9 out of the 10 children. For the immediate recall, the second part of the test, where they now have to recollect what they saw and try to do their best to draw it, almost 6 out of 10 children were unable to draw the figure as expected for their age. And now this study had about 5 parts per million fluoride in the water, so it's higher than we get here in the United States. But even a 5 part per million versus 1 part per million is not that large of a difference in exposure. But this is certainly a study that I think warrants careful consideration. So now let's look at another type of human study that has been conducted. This one's called the new Neurobehavioral Core Test Battery, and like I said earlier, it was developed by the World Health Organization as a means of identifying neurotoxins in the workplace. And basically, it's designed to look for subtle indications that the brain and the nervous system is being impacted by chemicals that workers are exposed to. And here's a study that was done in 2011 amongst fluoride-exposed aluminum workers in Iran. And they found that neurobehavioral testing can detect impairments in psychomotor performance from occupational F exposure. So they took a standard World Health Organization design test, applied it to fluoride-exposed workers, and they found evidence of neurotoxicity. Same thing with this study from China. They demonstrated various effects of occupational fluoride exposure on the central nervous system, and they conclude by saying that this test would be a useful way of looking for early evidence of harm amongst fluoride-exposed workers. So now let's look at another type of human study. And this is actually, these fetal brain studies were started to be conducted in the late 1980s in China, right around the same time when they started to look at the IQ. And it was in part these studies on the fetal brain that really prompted Chinese scientists to get concerned about fluoride. Because what we'll see here is when they looked at the brain of the fetus who were in the womb of mothers who had been exposed to high levels of fluoride, they found significant damage to the cells in the brain. And you'll see here in one of these studies that, in summary, the passage of fluorine through the placenta of mothers with chronic fluorosis and its accumulation within the brain of the fetus impacts the developing central nervous system and stunts neuron development. And now, in total, there have been 3 groups of studies that have looked at this. 4 published papers, 3 groups of studies. They all found essentially the same thing, looking at different types different types of damage, but all finding damage in the brain. And the levels of fluoride that the mothers were exposed to was quite high, but the urine fluoride levels in the mother were about 4.5 parts per million. So in the urine of the mother, there was about 4.5 parts per million, which is higher than we get in America. Most people in the United States probably have around 1 part per million. Sometimes that's on an average. But there are people in the United States who have 4.5 parts per million in the urine. In fact, there's some people in the United States who have up to 8 parts per million, 9 parts per million, particularly people who drink a lot of tea, particularly low-quality teas, because low-quality teas have higher levels of fluoride and lower levels of antioxidants. The fluoride content of tea is a marker of its quality. If you have more fluoride, it's lower quality tea and vice versa. But in recent studies looking at people who drink a lot of tea, particularly iced tea, we have found in case reports that they can get bone disease caused by fluoride, skeletal fluorosis. And when you look at the urine fluoride levels in these people who've been poisoned by too much fluoride in tea, their urine fluoride levels have been found to be 7, 8 parts per million. So for those women or those tea drinkers, most of them I think have actually been women in these case reports. One question that hasn't been asked is, what if they were pregnant? What if they had, and what happened to their babies? You know, that's a question that literally has never been asked in the scientific community. So there's a population out there that could very well be being damaged on the same level that we've seen in these aborted fetuses studies, which are high-level exposure cases in China. And it raises a real question that there could be serious harm that is flying under the radar. So now, let us look at one last type of study that has been done in humans with respect to fluoride neurotoxicity. And this study was done because of the fetal brain studies. Because the Chinese scientists knew that fluoride was getting into the brain of the fetus and damaging the brain, they wanted to see, well, let's look at the neonates after they're born. Let's look to see if we can see indications of central nervous system damage. And to do so, they used a type of study called a neonatal behavioral neurological assessment. Again, it's a standard test. It's been used in many other contexts for the same purpose of determining the effects of a condition on a child's neurological development. And when they applied that to the neonates of mothers exposed to high levels of fluoride, they found that their observations showed that fluoride as a toxic material to nerve development can have an adverse impact on the neurobehavioral developments of neonates and can cause abnormal changes of neurobehavioral capability during the neonate period. And based on their findings, they concluded that fluoride would be a chemical that would cause an IQ effect. You know, they would say according to them, this was a basis to understand why children in fluoride-exposed areas have lower IQ. I don't think it's necessarily for a child to have this kind of harm to later have a reduced IQ from fluoride, but it's certainly one of the mechanisms by which you could see an anti-IQ effect. So just to summarize here, there's been a lot of talk about fluoride and IQ. A lot of this was generated by a 2012 paper by Harvard scientists, which looked at 27 of the IQ studies, 26 of which had found reduced IQ in the fluoride-exposed children. And for some, that seems like an aberration. It seems unexpected. It seems surprising. But I think as we've seen here today, when you look at the other studies that have been done on fluoride, when you look at those animal studies, when you look at those learning and memory studies, and you look at those fluoride-treated rats, and you see that they consistently perform at an inferior rate to the non-fluoride exposed rats when it comes to indexes of memory and learning, it starts to look a lot more, it starts to make more sense that you would see that fluoride exposed children have lower IQ. And when you start to look at the other human studies that have been done on fluoride exposure, and you see effects on the whole range of standard tests for determining neurological function, The fact that fluoride could also cause IQ loss seems less exceptional. So today, the question to me no longer is, does fluoride damage the brain? Or does fluoride reduce IQ? I think those questions are pretty much resolved. Fluoride is a neurotoxin. It damages the developing brain. It will continue damaging the developing brain. There's millions of people in the world right now who are having their brains permanently injured by fluoride exposure. The only question today is, what is the dose of fluoride that is causing those effects? And how does that dose vary based on the susceptibility of the individual? How does that dose vary if you are a person with nutritional deficiencies or certain types of genetic susceptibilities? And those are the questions that if we really wanted to protect public health, if we really wanted to have a sane fluoride policy that puts public health over public policy, we would be asking, and we would be having studies done here in the United States to address them. Thank you.